All right, let's dive right into this explainer. I want you to take a second and picture the collapse of a government. If you're like most of us, you're probably picturing a scene straight out of a Hollywood blockbuster, right? You're imagining massive explosions, total chaos in the Capitol, maybe a sudden dramatic midnight military takeover. We've literally been conditioned to think that the end of a free society is this massive, loud event. But when we actually dig into the research and historical data from around the world, a very different and honestly much more unsettling reality emerges. Today, we're unpacking a phenomenon known as the quiet collapse, and we're looking exactly at how democratic institutions wither from within.
So, if it isn't that Hollywood explosion, what actually destroys a democracy? Well, the source material we're analyzing today points out something fascinating. The death of a free society is rarely announced by loud events. You usually don't see tanks rolling down the street, and there isn't necessarily some dictator shouting from a balcony to an angry crowd.
Instead, we have to contrast that loud death, the tanks, the wars, the classic dictatorships we expect, with the quiet death. And this quiet death is an invisible reality happening right now in both powerful and developing nations. What does it look like? It's a judge who suddenly becomes just a little too afraid to rule against the government. It's a journalist who quietly stops asking the hard questions. It's citizens who look at this decay and kind of just become complacent, accepting it as the new normal. It is literally like a complex mechanical system that looks perfectly shiny on the outside while the internal gears are just completely rusting away.
To really grasp how this works, here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll look at the invisible pillars. Then, how institutions slowly weaken. Third, we'll cover the cost to ordinary people. Fourth, normalizing selective justice. And finally, how to save democracy.
Okay, let's jump straight into Section 1, the invisible pillars.
Now, we aren't treating this as a partisan battlefield today. We're looking at this totally objectively, like mechanics diagnosing a system. A lot of people tend to think democracy is just about casting a vote every 4 or 5 years. But the reality? It actually survives because of a very specific set of structural components: an independent judiciary, free media, neutral election commissions, a functioning parliament, civil services, and human rights bodies. To put that into perspective, historical data actually shows us moments where just one single neutral election commission holding the line during a highly contested vote was the only thing preventing a total societal collapse. A true democracy is tested by how fiercely these institutions protect the weak, the minorities, and the critics.
Think of the government as a massive, powerful engine driving a nation forward. Naturally, you want a strong engine, right? But if you have this huge engine with absolutely no brakes, well, speed quickly turns into destruction. These institutions we just listed, they're the brakes. They are the essential mechanisms that prevent power from spiraling into tyranny.
Which brings us to Section 2, how institutions slowly weaken. So how do the brakes fail? The decay of this machinery almost always starts with politicization. It happens when appointments to these crucial institutions prioritize political loyalty over actual undeniable merit. The people running the brakes stop asking, "Is this right?" and start asking, "Will this anger the people in charge?" And one of the very first red flags is a weakening media ecosystem. Independent journalism, which is supposed to act as our civic watchdog, slowly morphs into entertainment. The truth becomes selective, and suddenly, citizens stop getting factual information and instead get spoon-fed these carefully crafted narratives.
Because here's the thing, real journalism discomforts every side. It asks the tough, uncomfortable questions. But when institutions wither, the media essentially transforms into a public relations firm. It just becomes marketing for power, entirely focused on praising authority. And we've seen this documented over and over in developing democracies, where independent papers are quietly bought out by oligarchs aligned with the ruling party. The news seamlessly shifts from watchdog to cheerleader. It's like a society walking entirely in the dark, but fully convinced it can still see perfectly.
An exact same thing happens to the legislature. A healthy parliamentary system absolutely relies on accountability. That means having a strong opposition that actively checks and balances policies. But a decaying system? It relies entirely on performance. The legislature devolves into a rubber stamp existing merely to echo whatever the ruling power wants. Governance turns into a theatrical performance rather than an effective system of safety checks. And history repeatedly shows us that unchecked, arrogant power eventually harms everyone, even its most loyal fans.
I want to pause on a really powerful quote from the source material for a second. Self-censorship is more dangerous than censorship because chains on the mind are invisible. Think about that. The exact moment people become afraid to speak, democracy starts shrinking. And this fear doesn't just come from the threat of being thrown in prison. It comes from online harassment, public humiliation, or the very real fear of losing your job.
Citizens literally lock themselves away, censoring their own thoughts before the government even has to lift a single finger.
So why does this happen? Well, divided citizens ask fewer questions. When the institutional machinery weakens, those in power often lean hard into emotional politics. If you look at historical case studies, they frequently show leaders pointing to an external enemy or an internal minority. They use religion or extreme nationalism as huge distractions while they're quietly rewriting judicial rules in the background. The logic here is devastatingly simple. A citizen who is intensely focused on hating their neighbor is definitely not going to demand accountability from the engine of government.
Moving to Section 3, the cost to ordinary people.
Now, you might be following along and thinking, okay, this all sounds very abstract and political. What does this actually have to do with me, my daily life, my wallet, my safety? Well, it triggers a direct domino effect. When the courts weaken, your personal access to justice becomes totally uncertain. When the media weakens, the truth you rely on to make basic decisions becomes manipulated. When oversight vanishes, your tax dollars quietly disappear into corruption. And as civil services weaken, favoritism grows, meaning you might not get that permit or that job you fairly earned. Ultimately, when elections lose trust, society becomes highly unstable. The investors flee, the talent leaves, and you're left living in a permanently angry, fragile system.
Let's look at Section 4, normalizing selective justice.
This right here is the boiling point of institutional decay. In fact, it's considered the absolute most dangerous stage, because injustice never remains selective forever. The source material imparts a really stark warning. When citizens actually start to celebrate the weakness of their own institutions, when they clap for the unfair treatment of a targeted group today just because they dislike their politics, they are guaranteeing that the system will eventually be bent against them tomorrow. A society that normalizes selective justice is without fail slowly normalizing injustice for everyone.
And finally, Section 5, how to save democracy.
Look, this is not a lost cause. Remember, it's a mechanical failure, which means we have an actionable repair manual. It starts with us. We have to choose to verify truth before sharing, rather than just blindly forwarding misinformation. We need to actively support difficult journalism that discomforts every side. It means standing up and demanding transparent, merit-based appointments to our institutions and protecting free speech by answering criticism with logic, not fear. We also absolutely need to teach civic values and critical thinking in our schools. And honestly, perhaps most importantly, we have to build unity beyond identity politics. Because a divided population is incredibly easy to manipulate, but a united public, that forces accountability from those in power.
Ultimately, every generation faces one defining question. Will we leave behind stronger institutions or stronger propaganda? Will future generations inherit a system of justice or a system of fear? The real strength of a nation isn't found in loud, passionate speeches from a podium. It's found in whether its institutions can still protect the truth when power becomes uncomfortable with it.